What if I told you that the God who created sex intended it to be one of humanity's most beautiful and sacred experiences? What if everything you've been taught about sexuality and spirituality has been filtered through centuries of religious misinterpretation and cultural shame? Stay with me, because we're about to uncover how organized religion systematically transformed one of God's most precious gifts into a source of guilt, fear, and dysfunction. This isn't an attack on faith itself, but rather an exploration of how human institutions have distorted divine intentions. The story I'm about to tell spans thousands of years, crosses multiple continents, and affects billions of people still today. It's a story of power, control, and the systematic suppression of human nature in the name of holiness. Let's start with a fundamental question that will challenge everything you think you know. If God created sex, the transformation wasn't instantaneous, nor was it biblical. It was a gradual process influenced by philosophy, politics, and power structures that had little to do with divine will. The roots of sexual shame in religious contexts can be traced back to ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the teachings of Plato and later philosophical schools that viewed the physical world as inferior to the spiritual realm. These philosophers taught that the body was a prison for the soul, and that physical pleasures, including sexual ones, were obstacles to spiritual enlightenment. When early Christianity began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, it encountered these philosophical traditions. Unfortunately, many early church fathers were more influenced by Greek dualism than by the Hebrew celebration of embodied existence found in their own scriptures. This philosophical contamination would prove to be one of the most devastating influences on Christian sexual ethics. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential church fathers, perfectly exemplifies this tragic merger. Before his conversion to Christianity, Augustine lived what he later considered a sexually immoral life. His personal guilt and shame about his past sexual experiences colored his theological writings for the rest of his life. He interpreted his personal struggle with sexuality as a universal human condition, teaching that sexual desire itself was the result of original sin. But here's what Augustine got wrong, and what has caused immeasurable damage. He confused his personal psychological issues with universal theological truth. His shame became doctrine. His personal guilt became church teaching. His individual struggle became humanity's supposed spiritual reality. Augustine taught that sexual pleasure, even within marriage, was tainted by sin. He believed that ideally, procreation should happen without sexual desire or pleasure, a view that directly contradicts the Song of Solomon, which celebrates erotic love in the most explicit terms found in religious literature. The influence of Augustine's sexual pessimism cannot be overstated. His teachings became the foundation for centuries of Christian sexual ethics, influencing everything from clerical celibacy to the church's attitudes toward pleasure, desire, and the human body. What began as one man's personal psychological struggle became the sexual shame experienced by billions of believers. The medieval period saw the institutionalization of these anti-sexual attitudes. The Catholic Church developed increasingly complex rules around sexuality, often going far beyond what Scripture actually taught. Sexual positions were regulated. The frequency of sexual relations was prescribed. Certain days of the week became off-limits for married couples. The Church created a bureaucracy of sexual shame. Thomas Aquinas, another hugely influential theologian, further systematized these attitudes. Drawing heavily on Aristotelian philosophy, he taught that sexual pleasure was inherently dangerous and should be minimized even within marriage. The purpose of sex, according to Aquinas, was purely procreative. any sexual activity that couldn't result in pregnancy was considered unnatural and sinful. This philosophical framework created an impossible situation for believers. They were told that God created them with sexual desires, but that acting on these desires, even within the bounds of marriage, was spiritually dangerous. The natural became unnatural. The God-given became shameful. The beautiful became dirty. The Protestant Reformation, while challenging many Catholic teachings, largely maintained these negative attitudes toward sexuality. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, while allowing clerical marriage, still viewed sexuality through the lens of Augustinian shame. They saw sexual desire as a consequence of the fall, something to be managed and controlled, rather than celebrated and enjoyed. The Puritans took these attitudes to even greater extremes. Their influence on Western, particularly American, sexual attitudes cannot be understated. They viewed the human body with suspicion and sexual pleasure with outright hostility. Even within marriage, sexual intimacy was seen as a necessary evil rather than a divine gift. But here's what's truly tragic about this historical development. It represents a complete departure from the original biblical attitude towards sexuality. The Hebrew Bible celebrates sexuality in ways that would make many modern religious people uncomfortable. The Song of Solomon doesn't just mention sexual love. It revels in it, describes it in explicit detail, and presents it as a reflection of divine love itself. The Hebrew word yada, often used to describe sexual intimacy, is the same word used to describe knowing God. This isn't coincidental. It suggests that sexual knowledge and spiritual knowledge are connected, that physical intimacy can be a path to understanding divine intimacy. This is about as far from Augustine's shame-based theology as one could possibly get. The tragedy deepens when we realize that this shame-based approach to sexuality has caused immeasurable psychological and spiritual damage. Generations of believers have been taught to view their most natural desires as sinful. They've been conditioned to feel guilty about their bodies, ashamed of their desires, and fearful of one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience. The psychological research is clear. Sexual shame is linked to depression, anxiety, relationship dysfunction, and spiritual crisis. When people are taught to hate part of themselves, they often end up hating all of themselves. Sexual shame doesn't create holiness. It creates wholeness-destroying neurosis. Religious sexual shame has particularly devastating effects on women. Throughout history, religious institutions have used shame as a tool to control female sexuality. Women have been taught that their bodies are temptations, that their desires are dangerous, and that their worth is tied to their sexual purity. This has created generations of women who are disconnected from their own sexuality and unable to experience the joy and pleasure that God intended for them. The purity culture movement of recent decades represents perhaps the most extreme manifestation of this historical trend. Young people, particularly young women, are taught that their sexual purity is their most valuable possession. They're given purity rings, make purity pledges, and are taught that any sexual expression outside of marriage literally damages their soul and reduces their worth as human beings. The psychological damage caused by purity culture is now being documented by researchers and therapists. Young adults who grew up in these environments often struggle with sexual dysfunction, an inability to experience pleasure, and deep-seated shame about their natural desires. The very thing that was supposed to prepare them for healthy marriages often destroys their ability to have healthy sexual relationships. But the damage isn't limited to individuals. It extends to marriages and families. When both partners in a marriage have been taught that sexuality is shameful, they often struggle to experience the intimacy and pleasure that could strengthen their relationship. Religious couples often have lower levels of sexual satisfaction, not because their faith prohibits pleasure, but because their religious conditioning has taught them to feel guilty about enjoying it. The irony is profound. The institution that claims to protect marriage has often damaged the very intimacy that makes marriage thrive. The religion that claims to follow a God of love has created obstacles to experiencing love in its most intimate form. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. Despite centuries of religious conditioning, human sexuality refuses to be fully suppressed. People continue to experience desire, to seek pleasure, and to find joy in sexual intimacy. The human spirit, it seems, remembers something that religious institutions have forgotten. Recent decades have seen a growing movement of religious people who are reclaiming a more positive, shame-free approach to sexuality. Progressive Christian theologians, Jewish scholars, and Islamic feminists are returning to their scriptures and finding celebration rather than condemnation. They're discovering that the shame was never divinely ordained. It was humanly constructed. These scholars point out that many of the biblical passages used to justify sexual shame have been mistranslated, taken out of context, or interpreted through the lens of later philosophical additions that have nothing to do with the original text. They're finding that when Scripture is read in its proper historical and cultural context, it presents a much more positive view of human sexuality. For example, the Hebrew Bible's approach to sexuality is remarkably sex-positive. It celebrates sexual pleasure, recognizes female sexual agency, and presents sexual intimacy as a gift to be enjoyed, rather than a temptation to be resisted. The biblical command to be fruitful and multiply isn't just about having children. In Hebrew, it's an invitation to be sexually creative and to flourish in intimate relationship. Even the New Testament, when read without the filter of later philosophical additions, is far less negative about sexuality than traditional interpretations suggest. Paul's teachings about sexuality, for instance, are primarily about maintaining social harmony in specific cultural contexts, rather than establishing universal moral principles about sexual shame. The Song of Solomon stands as perhaps the most radical challenge to religious sexual shame. This entire book of the Bible is an explicit celebration of erotic love. The lovers in the song don't express guilt, shame, or fear about their sexual desires. They celebrate them, revel in them, and see them as expressions of divine beauty. Religious authorities have often been uncomfortable with the Song of Solomon, attempting to interpret it as purely allegorical, rather than accepting it as a celebration of human sexuality. But the text itself resists these spiritualized interpretations. It's clearly about physical, sexual love, and it presents this love as something beautiful, holy, and worthy of celebration. The historical evidence suggests that the transformation of sexuality from celebration to shame was not a divine mandate, but a human choice. It was the result of specific philosophical influences, particular cultural contexts, and the personal psychological issues of influential religious leaders. It was never God's intention to fill people with shame about one of His most beautiful creations. This realization has profound implications for how we understand both sexuality and spirituality. If sexual shame was humanly constructed rather than divinely ordained, then it can be humanly deconstructed. People can reclaim a healthy, joyful, shame-free relationship with their sexuality without abandoning their faith. In fact, they may discover that doing so actually deepens their spiritual experience. The integration of sexuality and spirituality isn't just possible, it may be essential for wholeness. Many spiritual traditions recognize that sexual energy and spiritual energy are connected, that the same life force that creates physical pleasure can also create spiritual ecstasy. The separation of these energies may be one of the primary sources of both sexual dysfunction and spiritual emptiness. For individuals who have grown up with religious sexual shame, the healing process often involves recognizing that their shame was learned, not inherent. It involves understanding the historical development of these attitudes and realizing that they have options about what to believe. They can choose to embrace a more integrated, holistic approach to sexuality and spirituality. This doesn't mean abandoning moral boundaries or ethical considerations around sexuality. It means distinguishing between shame-based restrictions that damage human flourishing and wisdom-based guidelines that promote healthy relationships and personal growth. It means recognizing the difference between sexual ethics and sexual shame. Healthy sexual ethics focus on consent, respect, love, and mutual flourishing. They're concerned with how sexual expression can enhance rather than damage human relationships and personal growth. Shame-based approaches, in contrast, focus on control, suppression, and the belief that sexual desire itself is problematic. The difference between these approaches is profound. Ethical approaches to sexuality empower people to make wise, loving choices about their sexual expression. Shame-based approaches disempower people by convincing them that their desires are inherently problematic and that they cannot be trusted with their own sexuality. For couples seeking to integrate their faith and their sexuality, this historical understanding can be liberating. It means they don't have to choose between being spiritual and being sexual. They can embrace both as part of their full humanity. They can approach their intimate relationship as sacred space, rather than as spiritual danger. This integration often leads to deeper intimacy, both physical and spiritual. When couples are able to approach their sexuality without shame, they often discover levels of connection and pleasure they never thought possible. They find that sexual intimacy can actually enhance their spiritual relationship rather than threatening it. The implications extend beyond individual relationships to entire communities. Religious communities that embrace shame-free approaches to sexuality often become more welcoming, more psychologically healthy, and more attractive to people seeking authentic spiritual community. They become places where people can bring their whole selves rather than having to hide fundamental parts of their humanity. The future of religion and sexuality doesn't have to be defined by the shame of the past. There's a growing movement of people who are discovering that they can be both deeply spiritual and sexually healthy. They're finding that the integration of these aspects of human experience leads to greater wholeness rather than compromise. This movement represents a return to something ancient rather than an embrace of something new. It's a return to the original divine intention that sexuality should be celebrated rather than shamed, that the human body should be honored rather than despised, and that physical pleasure can be a pathway to spiritual joy rather than an obstacle to it. The question for each individual is whether they will continue to carry the burden of shame that was never theirs to carry, or whether they will have the courage to embrace the full spectrum of their humanity as a gift from their Creator. The choice between shame and celebration, between condemnation and integration, between fear and love, remains open. The history of how religion turned sex into shame is ultimately a history of missed opportunities to embrace the full beauty of human experience, to celebrate the divine creativity expressed in sexuality and to help people become whole rather than fragmented. But history doesn't have to be destiny. Each generation has the opportunity to choose a different path, to heal the wounds of the past, and to reclaim the sacred sexuality that was always meant to be part of human flourishing. The God who created sex as very good is still the same God today. The question is whether religious communities will have the courage to trust that divine assessment rather than the human shame that is accumulated over centuries of misinterpretation and control.